Our big story this morning, though, a formal impeachment inquiry into President Trump. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi made the announcement yesterday. Now, we know some of you have questions about what an impeachment inquiry really means. So our Verify team is answering that question. Does this announcement officially start the impeachment process?
This is an NBC News special report.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi stepped up to a podium on the Capitol with an historic announcement.
Moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry.
But what does that mean? And does that officially start the impeachment process? Our sources for this story, Speaker Pelosi's speech itself, and the United States legal code that outlines impeachment rules. First, let's define what an impeachment inquiry actually is. Essentially, it's announcing they'll launch an investigation. Here's the interesting part. That's already started. Several different House committees are already investigating President Donald Trump, dating back to allegations of Russia meddling in the 2016 election. Tuesday, Speaker Pelosi announced those committees will continue their work.
I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations.
But that doesn't officially start the process. In order to impeach President Trump, one of the House committees investigating the president must pass articles of impeachment, essentially the charges against him. That would move to the full House, and that would have to pass by a majority vote. 2 presidents, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, have been impeached, but a president has never been convicted and removed. That process plays out in the Senate. There would be a trial with Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts presiding. The Senate would be the equivalent of the jury. It would take 2/3 of the Senate to vote for a conviction for President Trump to be removed. All of that to say, we can verify the notion that the impeachment process has begun against the president is false. This is still just the investigation phase. And even if it did, the framers of our Constitution made sure removing a sitting president is a long and difficult process. It's not to be taken lightly.
If you have something you want us to verify, contact us on Twitter or Facebook. We're willing to dig into your questions. You can also send an email to verify@11alive.com.